And as you see, we're taking a look there over the Gaza Strip. So many eyes have been on the Middle East over the last few days, as it was just announced that Israel's cabinet approved a deal early Saturday morning for them for a ceasefire in Gaza that would release dozens of hostages held there. This is going to be a pause on the 15-month war with Hamas, bringing the sides just now a step closer to ending their deadliest and most destructive fighting ever. It was officially announced just after 1 a.m. there in Jerusalem time. And now I want to bring into the conversation Jonathan Schanzer with the FDD. Thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now. Of course, we've been covering this story as it's unfolded this week. What are your initial thoughts? And from what I understand, you just landed back here in the States from Israel a few hours ago.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a fascinating week for me to be there. For the first couple of days, I landed on Monday, and for the first couple of days, all we were hearing about was, will they, won't they? Will Hamas agree? Can the government get to the right terms with Hamas? At the end of the day, they got basically what they wanted. This was a deal that was actually put on the table in May of last year. Hamas rejected that deal repeatedly. The big difference maker, I would argue, there were probably three of them. One was the killing of Yahya Sinwar in the middle of last year. Then Hezbollah, the Iran proxy out of Lebanon, they agreed to a ceasefire after really getting beat up by the Israeli military. I think they realized that it was a mistake to try to open up a second front. And then, of course, we saw the election of Donald Trump, who issued that tweet saying that the gates of hell would open if the hostages weren't returned. So Hamas and their patrons in Iran and in Turkey and in Qatar, I think they were all feeling the heat. And so that deal that Hamas had no to all the way back in May, repeatedly, they finally agreed to. In Israel, not everybody loved the deal. I think there's a lot of relief. A lot of the hostage families are obviously very excited about the prospect of being able to bring their loved ones home. There's, of course, fear that you could see some of these hostages coming back in body bags. We don't know who's alive and who's dead. But there is also some opposition to this in Israel, because the Israelis are going to pay a heavy price for the release of 33 hostages. They're going to release 1,000 Hamas fighters that have blood on their hands. This is not sitting well with everyone, especially those who fear that Hamas might try to kidnap more Israelis in order to get bargaining chips to get the release of additional terrorists. So the debate continues in Israel, but the government has approved this, and we expect it to start to go through either Sunday or Monday, depending on the final terms of that deal.
And there's just so much to get into with this deal and what the lead up was like. I want to start with the American side. We do know that President Biden had a hand in this. He produced this deal earlier on in 2024, as we just discussed. It just now came to a close here. But we also see that the hands of Donald Trump, he's also said that his involvement, and as you mentioned there, his election win is also playing a role. What are your thoughts on this overall? Who really gets the credit for pushing this side on the American side to help this deal go through?
Well, look, I think most people in the region right now think that Biden didn't do enough, that he could have put more pressure on Hamas's patrons. Again, Iran, Qatar, Turkey, the three terror sponsoring countries that have been giving Hamas the backing that it never deserved and probably should have never gotten. And the Biden administration was really tiptoeing around all of this. They were not issuing tough demands. And you see Trump come in and he just seals the deal with a tweet. I mean, it's really amazing when you think about it. There's also something else that was very strange that I learned while I was over there, and that was that Stephen Witkoff, the president-elect's incoming envoy for Middle East negotiations, the man who's expected to try to broker a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel for normalization, he was actually in Qatar negotiating with Hamas's patrons before he even took the job. This is highly irregular to have somebody who wasn't even in the chair yet to go over there and to push this thing over the finish line. And I think, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this before. I cannot remember it in recent history where a president-elect sends somebody that's not even getting paid to do the work to get over there and do something to end a crisis. I think it really is reflective, though, of how Donald Trump just did not want to start this second presidency of his with a Middle East crisis lingering. I think at the end of the day, this is a man who probably just wanted to see some quiet so that he could focus on the domestic priorities here in the United States. And so at least for the first 42 days, that's how long the first phase of this deal will last, it is likely that we'll see quiet, and that is apparently what Donald Trump wanted.
And I'm glad you also brought that up. Let's talk about Benjamin Netanyahu as well, of course, the prime minister there in Israel. So after this deal was initially announced, Benjamin Netanyahu, he came out and he said, hey, there are some last minute complications. Can you sort of break down for folks who haven't been paying as much close attention this week to what those last minute complications were and how they were able to get past them to get this deal finally on the table?
You know, there are a lot of things that are flying around about this disagreement. It was, maybe backloaded for Hamas in a way that I think the Israelis are still not happy about. Most of the hostages that are going to be released are going to be released in the back end of these 42 days. And that will likely, the bulk of them are going to be released after Israel is supposed to agree to a second phase of this deal, which would guarantee the end of the fighting. So I think the Israelis were pushing back on that. But I think in the end, it appears they acquiesced to it. What I heard was the big sticking point was just who was going to be released. The Israelis have refused to allow what they call celebrity terrorists, so people that would be celebrated on the streets of the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, people that have multiple murders on their hands. The Israelis refuse to allow them to be released. There are some killers who are going to get out as a result of this deal, but they're not going to be those big names. The big question, at least as I understood it, was who were they even looking at? They're about, 4,000 Hamas prisoners right now in the Israeli system. They had to narrow it down to 1,000 to be released. And so the Israelis picked 500, Hamas picked 500, and that was apparently the challenge, was actually just getting to the number that both would agree to without having those high-profile celebrity terrorists on that list.
And I want to put our focus back there on the hostages. We were just showing some video, of course, of all those posters. It's been heartbreaking to hear the families of those victims speak out over the last 15 months, devastated that their loved ones were taken away from them. But as you mentioned, the big question, we know that 33 are set to be released in this first phase. How many, though, are ultimately alive? We did hear some numbers being floated out by the Israeli government saying that they believe there are about a little less than 100, I believe, hostages total, but they're not sure how many are alive. Can you sort of speak to that and what those folks are now trying to anticipate over the next 6 weeks?
Yeah, I mean, there are 98 that are still in Hamas custody. I think there've been about 110 or so, maybe even 120 hostages released up until now. Some bodies have come back. The Israelis have recovered some. Out of the 98 that are still going to be returned, I think the estimate is that roughly half are still alive. That's obviously not great news. But the fact that there are any that are alive is really what's motivating the Israelis. And by the way, the Israelis also want to give proper burials to those who've been killed. I think the first release of these hostages will be an emotional one for the families, because what we're going to be talking about are the younger women who were in Hamas custody. These are women that I think most people expect to hear horrific stories of sexual abuse, sexual violence, beatings, and the like. When they come back, their stories will be told eventually. And this is likely to spark massive emotional outrage on the part of the Israeli public. There is also another name that I think we all need to keep an eye out for. That is this toddler who was kidnapped on October 7th. His name is Kfir Bibas. There is a lot of speculation as to whether he's alive or no longer among the living. I think that will probably be the most emotional name when we see the release. If he comes back in a body bag, I can only imagine the response from the Israeli public. I think they're still hoping, maybe against their better judgment, that this young child will be released. But we're going to be hearing about some names that will absolutely evoke strong emotions among these hostage families. But again, they're going to be really, I think, they're desperate to just bring closure after 15 months of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. These families are just, they're holding their breath, and we're getting close here. When I left, you could really feel the anticipation on the streets of Israel.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. We also have some information here from the Associated Press. According to their reporting, Israel's prison services says that it's going to be transporting the prisoners instead of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which handled the transportation during the first ceasefire, to avoid public expressions of joy. That's in quotes. The prisoners have been accused of those crimes, as you mentioned: incitement, vandalism, supporting terror activities, attempted murder, or even throwing stones or Molotov cocktails. You've spoken so far, Jonathan, to the nature of these people who will be released from captivity. You also mentioned that that's kind of the hesitation on the side of the Israeli people as well. What do you feel like the ultimate feeling will be on Sunday or Monday when this process eventually goes through? How will the people truly respond?
Well, look, I mean, I think let's look at both sides of this. Imagine you're a Gazan and you've been living in Gaza. You didn't want this war. And look at the destruction that Hamas has brought through this assault, this mass murder that they carried out on October 7th. Now imagine that you have some of the people who are caught on the battlefield and they are released and they are sent back to Gaza. Do you think these people are going to get a hero's welcome, or do you think the people will jeer them? And I think it's an interesting question. I don't know how to answer that. I can only tell you that if someone started a war that led to the destruction of my home, I don't think I would call them a hero. I think I would probably boo them and tell them to get out of my property. So I think that, it's going to be interesting to see what happens when the Gazans and West Bankers see some of these people that brought the destruction that has ensued over the last 15 months. In Israel, I think most of the population truly is just, their hearts have been breaking. You see those posters everywhere, the bumper stickers, the yellow ribbons. This has just been tearing at the soul of the country. And so they're desperate to get them back. I think there is a divide, a pretty significant rift right now between left wing and right wing in Israel. The left says, bring them back at any cost. The right says, bring them back, but not at any cost. Let's not give terrorists back to the West Bank or Gaza. By the way, some of them will be going to Qatar and Turkey. As I mentioned, these are two state sponsors of terrorism that have been supporting Hamas. They may receive some of the prisoners that have the most blood on their hands because the Israelis don't want them there. But I think, most of the Israelis would say, bring them home. But I think there's a chunk of them that are saying, bring them home, but not at this cost. And so it's for that reason we've seen some members of parliament in Israel object to this deal.
And I also want to talk about the region at large. Where do you think they go from here? Obviously, you mentioned earlier in our conversation the ceasefire deal that happened with Hezbollah a bit earlier on, before this one was on the table with Hamas for Israel. But we also know the proxies, Iran in the region, as well as the Houthis. They're still a major factor as well. What are your thoughts about what becomes there in the Middle East in the coming months?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think Hamas, it's going to take years and years to rebuild, if they're ever able to rebuild at all. They're just not going to have the same capabilities, and they're going to have to be focusing, if anything, on the reconstruction of Gaza. In Lebanon, the leadership of Hezbollah, which was Iran's strongest proxy, they are now eviscerated. I mean, the top leaders are dead. The mid-level leaders are injured or dead. The arsenal is depleted. I think it was a major victory for the Israelis in Lebanon, and that was a war that certainly Israel didn't want, but they found a way to finish it, at least for now. In Syria, there were proxies that were fighting against Israel. Well, the Assad regime just collapsed in December, and it's not likely to come back. So that's another front that looks a lot better for Israel. It's been pretty quiet in Iraq. That's another place where we saw Iranian militias firing rockets at Israel. That has gone quiet, and it'll be interesting to see whether Iran is able to cajole some of these militias to begin firing at Israel again. Doesn't seem likely, at least for right now. So the two areas that I'm watching really are the Houthis, which you mentioned. This is now a terrorist organization that is doing two things that should shock us all. One is they possess ballistic missiles. These are long distance missiles that can go like 1,000 miles with some accuracy and target Israel. My first night in Israel, the sirens went off at 3 a.m. because one of these missiles had just penetrated Israeli airspace. Really kind of a jarring thing to happen, especially with someone like me from the United States. You're not used to hearing things like that. And that's what Israelis have been dealing with just about every night. But then there's the other part of this, which has had a direct impact on the United States. And that is that the Houthis have shut down the Red Sea. That means that no ships are able to pass through there unless, of course, they're Chinese or Russian or Iranian. But that's shutting down a waterway that is responsible for something like 10 to 12% of global trade. So I actually think there's a really interesting decision forthcoming here for the Trump administration. How are they going to handle this Houthi problem? It's an Israeli issue, but it's also an American issue. It's a global issue now. The last area I would just point to is the West Bank, which is the other area with a large population of Palestinians. There have been a lot of operations, IDF operations, targeting Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and other terrorist groups. They're still running around there in the West Bank. That could be another area that flares up. But generally speaking, when you look around the region, that war that started on October 7th by Hamas, sponsored by the Iranians, it's gone from 7 fronts really down to 2, if we're to be honest. And I think the Israelis still have the upper hand. And I think that's probably a good thing at the end of the day, that Iran is beginning to retreat. The question is now, really the final question, is whether Donald Trump works with the Israelis to further weaken Iran to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I think that's the big question in front of the Trump administration once things get underway.
And it certainly will be one that we're watching. Do want to show you this look that we also have there in Jerusalem at this time. I also want to point this out because I found it interesting. I want to know if you can add some color to this conversation and to help people at home understand the significance of this. We do know that the government did announce the approval at 1 a.m. local time there in Jerusalem and confirmed that the ceasefire will go into effect on Sunday. It's important because this hours-long cabinet meeting went well past the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. Of course, that's a sign of this moment's importance. Do you think that those members of the cabinet, of course, wanting to honor the Sabbath, but also understanding how critical it is to bring home these hostages who've been missing their families, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a crisis of sorts. I mean, I have to say, from what I heard in Israel, there was really no chance that this thing wasn't going to get passed. But this is a right-wing government. And there are members of this cabinet that simply did not want to release those 1,000 Hamas prisoners. That was a red line for them. And so I think there was some horse trading going on. Agreements had to be struck between Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and some of the outliers from within his coalition. So I think that needed to happen, but also their voices needed to be heard. They needed to go on the record. There may be some challenges, by the way. In fact, I expect them. There'll be some petitions filed at Israel's Supreme Court where they're going to try to stop some of the terrorists that may be on the list for release. There'll be families that are trying to work through the judicial system to ensure that that doesn't happen. I think at the end of the day, it's probably not going to work. I think the vast majority, if not all of those prisoners that are going to be released, these Hamas terrorists, I think they're going to get released. But I think all of that needed to play out. And I think you're very right to point out that doing this, that went overtime into Shabbat or Sabbath, as we would call it, this was extraordinary. It was exceptional. But these are exceptional times right now. It's a dramatic moment right now in Israel.
And before I let you go, Jonathan, the last question that I really have for you is, do you think that this agreement that is currently in place will go the distance through all three phases? Or which phase do you see, if there are any complications, that it will truly run into? Because, of course, I think all of us from the outside looking in just would like to see ultimately peace in the Middle East and those hostages returned to their families.
Yeah, I mean, I think wanting peace is obviously a good thing. I think really the question is peace on what terms? And I think that if the Israelis agree to peace at any cost, that cost will be that Hamas is able to rebuild. And, this is an organization that killed 1,200 people in one day and kidnapped 254. And I don't think that the Israelis are going to want to agree to end the conflict on terms that would be advantageous to Hamas, that would give them an opportunity to get off their backs and back up on their feet and to begin to fight again. So my sense is that, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly in Israel right now, they'll make this initial 42 days work, which will see the release of the hostages, those 33. After that, they're talking about men of fighting age, and then that's the second phase of hostages that would be released. And the last one would be bodies. And I don't know if the Israelis are going to be willing to trade bodies for a full end of conflict. I'm not even sure they will be willing to trade those men of fighting age. I think we will likely see this full first phase go through. After that, I think it's going to get tough for the Israelis to agree, because they have this very justifiable need to finish off Hamas. They don't want to see this terror group come back to terrorize Israel again. If they don't take care of this problem now, they learned this the hard way, because they fought Hamas for multiple rounds of conflict and they never took them out. I think they realize now if they don't take them out, it's going to come back to bite them again. And they have a very different mentality now. They learned some tough lessons on 10/7 and in the subsequent months leading up to today.
Jonathan Schanzer with the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now. You're breaking down the complexities and, of course, as the world is watching this ceasefire agreement that is set to go into effect on Sunday. We appreciate you for joining us on Live Now.
Anytime.